The auctioneer's gavel fell with a dry crack in the dusty square, but the commodity on the block today wasn't cattle. It was a human life. On a makeshift wooden platform, a young widow and her 3 trembling children were being treated as property, the final payment for a dead man's gambling debt. As the cruel jeers of the crowd reached a fever pitch and all hope seemed lost, a silent figure detached himself from the mob. He had no gold or silver, but he had something far more valuable. The frontier square simmered in heat and chaos. The whinnying of horses, the lowing of herded cattle, and the dry crack of bids rang out from all corners. But in one shadowed corner, the air tasted of wretchedness instead of profit. A woman and 3 children were being displayed on a crude wooden platform. It was meant to be a sale, but in truth, it was just another act in the theater of misery so common in this dusty land. Hank Barrowman strode forward, his hand clenched into a threatening fist. He pointed at the pale, trembling woman, 3 small faces peeking from behind her worn skirt. She looked too young to bear the title of widow, but death had already claimed her man. His voice roared, silencing the other sounds. This woman's husband owed me $1,000. He lost it all at the card table, then dropped dead like a sack of rotten grain. Now she and her brood are my property. I intend to use her labor to pay off the debt. Sarah stood unsteadily, her fingers clutching the thin fabric that covered her children. 1 boy, 2 girls, all under 3, their eyes wide with terror. Her voice fractured as she spoke. The children are innocent. They owe you nothing. Please don't take them, Barrowman sneered. One of his brutes grabbed her son's arm, dragging him forward. The twin girls were wrenched from Sarah's grasp, their shrieks tearing through the air. She collapsed, a desperate plea tearing from her throat. Oh God, no, not them. She tried to hold onto her son as her daughters were pulled away, but 2 strong arms yanked him free. She fell backward, her hands still clawing at the air where her children had been. Then she fell to the ground, crawling toward Barrowman's legs, sobbing until she had nothing left. The heel of his boot struck her side, making her gag. A trickle of blood blooming at the corner of her mouth. A cold laughter rippled through the onlookers, cruel and indifferent. And then, from the ring of drunkards and gawkers, a figure quietly detached itself. A man in his 40s, tall and rugged, wearing a leather coat the color of sun-scorched earth. He placed a bottle of whiskey on a nearby plank, then walked directly toward the platform. The crowd hushed as his shadow fell over them. I will pay the debt, a deep, steady voice announced. For her, and for the children. A few incredulous laughs answered him. A cattle drover stepped forward, looking him up and down. Think you've got the coin, old man? That coat says you've got nothing. The mockery drew a few more sniggers. Barrowman glared, but then he flipped open his stained ledger. $500, not a cent less. And I want it here by sunrise tomorrow. Jonas put his hand inside his coat. When he drew it out, a small object glinted in the sun. Silence fell. It was a simple silver necklace, its tarnish worn down around a small locket. Jonas placed it gently on the table. I don't have it all today, but this means something to me. It was my mother's. I will be back with the rest. And you will. Let her and the children go. The crowd didn't move. Barrowman stared at the necklace, his lip curling in a sneer. You want to trade your mother's keepsake for this lot? For a woman and her kids? You're a bigger fool than I thought. Jonas met Barrowman's gaze, his voice low. Then I will prove I am no fool. He turned, not glancing back at the stunned faces. With deliberate steps, he picked up his bottle of whiskey and walked toward the edge of the square. On the platform, Sarah's sobs had fallen silent. Her children huddled around her, clutching at her skirt. She looked up at the necklace on the table, confusion and hope mingling on her face. Amidst the spreading silence and the cruel laughter, one thing was clear. Someone had stepped forward. Someone had seen their worth, and for a single ragged heartbeat, against the roar of the world, a fragile seed of hope had just tremulously sprouted in her eyes. The wooden wheels rolled sluggishly over the dusty trail, carrying them further and further away from the clamorous world behind them. Dusk was falling, staining the canyon rim purple. Sarah sat huddled in the back, her arms a final desperate fortress around her three small beings. Each jolt of the wagon was a reminder, but her mind was no longer there. It was replaying a single brutal truth. She had been bought and sold once more. She didn't dare look at the man holding the reins. Every man who had ever helped her had taken more than they gave. So when she spoke, her voice was little more than a shattered whisper, her head bowed low. "Sir, I will do whatever you ask. I will work hard. You will not have to worry." Jonas Cade did not reply. His eyes remained fixed on the path ahead, his hands on the reins twitching only slightly as the horses climbed the final ridge of the valley dot. As dusk settled, the log cabin came into view. It was plain, with a porch that sagged with the years, nestled against a line of pine trees. A thin thread of smoke curled from the stone chimney, the only sign of life amidst the sound of the wind sighing through the grass and the faint whimpering of one of the twins. Jonas stepped down first. He didn't say a word. His arms were steady but gentle as he lifted each child, carried them inside, and carefully laid them on a simple mattress beside the stove. Then he turned to Sarah and handed her a tin cup of water. "You and the children. Sleep in here tonight," he said. "I'll be in the barn." She looked up, a flicker of shock in her eyes, but he was already walking away. The wooden door creaked shut behind him. That night, Sarah curled around her children like a wounded animal. She didn't sleep, not really. Her senses were strained, listening to every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside. She waited for the knock on the door, for the demand to remove her clothes, the price of safety she had paid too many times, but it never came. When dawn broke, she slipped quietly from the blanket, careful not to wake the children. She began to work. She used the hem of her own skirt to scrub the floor, fetched water from the pump outside, and tried to make porridge from a sack of cornmeal she found. Her hands bled from the cold water, but she just tore strips of cloth to bind them and kept going. If she worked hard enough, maybe he would let them stay longer. Maybe he wouldn't send the children away. She was stirring the pot with a trembling finger when the door creaked open again. Jonas stood there, silhouetted in the morning light. He looked at her, a real look. He saw her red and swollen hands, her dress soaked from the waist down. The smell of smoke clung to her, mixed with the scent of desperation. He did not raise his voice. He did not move. "You don't need to act like a servant," he said, his voice calm, his eyes unreadable. "And you don't need to bleed to prove you are worthy of a roof." She froze, her finger hovering over the pot. "Just take care of the children. That is all I ask." She turned to face him, slowly, uncertainly. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but the words were stuck. Instead, she just stared at the man with dust on his boots, and a silence etched deep in his bones. The one man who had not demanded anything from her. She didn't know if kindness like that could be real. But for the first time since her husband's death, she looked a man straight in the eye. And in the way Jonas looked at her, not as a burden, not as a prize, but as a person, she felt something long forgotten stir inside her. Hope. Every morning, Sarah rose while the sky was still the deep indigo of early dawn. She would slip quietly from the mattress, careful not to disturb the three sleeping angels. She would stoke the fire, fetch water from the old pump, clean the worn floorboards, and even muck out the horse stalls, though her shoulders ached. The memory of being owned still clung to her like a bruise, so she worked without stopping, as if sheer effort could build a permanent future. Jonas never told her to stop, but he never asked for more. Meanwhile, the children, with the resilience of wildflowers, had quickly taken root. They chased each other around the porch, invented games with pebbles and sticks, and took turns petting the old hound that lounged in the sun. The boy started calling Jonas the silent uncle, and the name stuck. Jonas would only nod barely, reacting, but sometimes a faint smile would pull at the corner of his weathered lips. He didn't speak much, but his hands were never idle. He fixed the warped step on the porch, patched holes in the roof, and sanded down splinters on the railing so the twins could lean over without getting cut. One afternoon, he built 3 small stools, each one the perfect height for a child to sit at the kitchen table. He even carved their first initial into the legs. Then came the unspoken cares: a new hook by the door for Sarah's shawl, a clothesline strung up in the yard. And then one evening, quietly, without fanfare, he placed a small wooden box on the table and walked away. Inside was an old ivory comb, a neatly folded cotton handkerchief, and 3 pairs of child-sized woolen socks, hand-stitched and as soft as clouds. Sarah stared at it for a long time. She didn't need to ask. She knew he had made them, and then that night, the sky tore open. Rain came down in sheets, and the wind howled through the trees like grieving wolves. Thunder cracked and shook the ground. The children huddled together in fear. But it was not the storm that shattered Sarah's peace. Her son, Jonah, was burning with a fever. His skin was hot to the touch, his breathing ragged, his small body shivering and sweating all at once. Sarah tried cool compresses, cradled him to her chest, but panic began to creep into her bloodstream. "I need help," she whispered, almost to herself. Jonas, who had just come in from the barn, heard her. He looked at the boy, touched his forehead, then, without a word of explanation, he turned and vanished into the violet night. Sarah stood, frozen at the door, rain stinging her face, watching the darkness swallow him whole. Time dragged on, an hour, maybe more. Then, footsteps, a shadow at the edge of the porch. Jonas returned, soaked to the bone, his shirt clinging to him. In his hands was a bundle of damp herbs tied with twine. He thrust them toward Sarah, water dripping from his hair. "Boil these," he said, his voice hoarse. "Soak a cloth in the steam, press it to his chest, then his forehead. It will bring the fever down." She moved like a machine, her heart pounding. The small cabin filled with the sharp scent of pine and roots. They sat on either side of the child, trading cloths, sharing water, whispering reassurances neither of them fully believed. The fire in the hearth burned low. When the first rays of dawn crept over the mountains, Jonah's fever had broken. Sarah sat with her back against the wall, her arms wrapped around her now sleeping son. Jonas leaned in the doorway, steam still rising from his drenched clothes, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. She looked at him, a real look. For the first time, she did not see a man who had used a keepsake to buy her freedom. She saw a man who had defied a storm with nothing but silence and stubbornness to save her son. She saw the image of a father. And for the first time, she believed that this roof, one day, might truly become a home. Spring arrived like a shy guest, without knocking. The last patches of ice still clung to the shadows beneath the pines, but the earth had begun to soften. The breeze carried the scent of thaw and possibility. Sarah knelt by the porch, her fingers stained with brown earth, carefully pressing seeds into a small garden bed. Forget-me-nots, lavender, wild daisies, the flowers her mother had once taught her to tend, from a time when her world was still warm. The children ran barefoot through the tall grass, their laughter clear and bright as they chased the old dog. One afternoon, the boy playfully tugged on Jonas's beard, making his twin sisters giggle so hard they fell over. Jonas just grunted, feigning annoyance, but the corner of his mouth twitched into a smile. From the window, Sarah watched them, dish towel in hand, her chest rising with an emotion she couldn't name. It was gratitude, yes, but threaded through with a quiet ache, guilt, because every moment of peace felt borrowed. Every act of kindness from Jonas reminded her that he had traded something sacred, his mother's memory, to buy her and her children a second chance. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and Jonas was hammering a new window frame into place, Sarah stepped onto the porch. She carried a small, worn cloth bundle. Her fingers trembled as she held it out. "This," she said, her eyes fixed on the ground, "was my mother's. A silver hairpin. I have kept it since I was a girl, even when I had no home left to return to." She opened the cloth, revealing the delicate pin shaped like a plum blossom, its edges smoothed by years of handling and heartbreak. "You gave away. Your mother's keepsake for us," she continued, her voice low. "I cannot let you bear that alone. Please, use this to get it back." Jonas looked at the pin, then at her. "No," he said, his voice soft but rough from years of disuse. "I have my own way. And you should keep that. Memories like that cannot be used to pay another's debts." She didn't argue, just nodded and went back inside, the cloth still clutched in her hand. That night, after the children had fallen asleep, Sarah knelt beside their small mattress and cried. Not from sorrow, but from a release so overwhelming it felt like a flood. For the first time, she was being protected without being expected to pay, being seen and not owned. The next morning, she joined Jonas on the porch, 2 steaming cups of coffee between them. The flowers she had planted were just beginning to peek through the earth like timid secrets. "My husband," she began, "was not always like he became. When the mine closed and he lost his job, he lost himself too. Drank too much, gambled worse. He kept telling me everything would be fine, right up until the day those men came knocking." Jonas said nothing. He just listened. Sarah took a breath. "He left me a letter," she whispered. "Said he had failed us, that there was no way out. I found it the next morning. He had thrown himself in the river." The silence that followed was not awkward. It was shared and weighted and real. "For a long time I thought it was my fault," Sarah said. "That I wasn't strong enough to stop him, that I wasn't worth staying for. But since I've been here, I'm learning something new." She looked out across the green valley, her fingers tracing the grain of the porch rail. "We do not always choose how our story ends," she said. "But perhaps we can choose what happens next." He nodded once, then turned to her and said, his voice quiet, "You are the only one here who knows how to make these flowers bloom. Take care of them." She smiled. The tears didn't fall this time, but the warmth that bloomed in her chest felt strong enough to outlast another winter. The necklace had not been reclaimed. Jonas had not gone back to San Rio since the day of the auction, not to the tavern, not to Hank Barrowman's ranch. And in a town where silence only feeds speculation, stories began to grow like poisonous weeds. After a rain, whispers passed in saloons and feed stores that the woman with triplets had been bought but not fully paid for, that Jonas Cade had taken something he had no right to, that Barrowman was being made a fool, and Hank Barrowman did not. Like being made a fool. He sent Travis. Travis was not a large man, but he had a twisted smile and eyes like shattered glass. He had worked for Barrowman for years, keeping his books, chasing his runaways, doing the things Hank didn't want to be publicly associated with. When he rode out to Jonas's land, he carried no badge and no papers, only a cover story and a flask of rye in his saddlebag. "Just a trader," he said when Sarah answered the door. "Heard you have a fine garden here. Thought I might trade for some herbs or eggs." Sarah stood in the doorway, her body half shielding the inside of the cabin. She held her youngest child on her hip. "We don't trade much," she said, her voice wary. Travis chuckled, undeterred. "Is that so? A pity. A real nice place you have here. Looks like someone's been taking good care of it. And of you." There was something in his tone that made her skin crawl, but she forced a polite, shallow smile. Jonas was out in the far pasture, mending a fence. Sarah gave Travis a few bundles of dried lavender and sent him on his way with nothing more than a nod. But long after he disappeared over the ridge, her hands would not stop shaking. She didn't tell Jonas that night. She told herself she was being paranoid, that maybe he really had come for herbs. But 2 nights later, as she stepped outside to shake crumbs from a tablecloth, she caught the glint of something near the barn. A figure, a shadow slipping around the side of the feed shed. She clutched the cloth tighter, her heart hammering. The children were inside. Jonas was asleep in the barn loft. She crept toward the shed, but before she could call out, the figure vanished into the trees. The next morning, Jonas found the knife. It was wedged deep into one of the porch posts, deliberate, not rusted, not forgotten. The blade was thin and cruel, with a carved bone handle, the kind used by men who meant business. Jonas pulled it free, turning it slowly in his calloused hands. His jaw was set, his face a mask. Sarah stood behind him, holding the screen door. Half open. "I saw someone," she confessed, her voice soft. "2 nights ago, near the shed. I thought. I didn't want to worry you." Jonas nodded once, then turned and walked into the barn. She followed. Inside, she found him kneeling beside an old cedar trunk. He opened it, brushing aside a folded Union Army jacket and a pair of worn boots. Beneath them lay a long object wrapped in oilskin, a rifle. He pulled it free, sat down on a bench, and began to clean it with slow, precise movements, oiling the chamber, inspecting the sight, running a cloth through the barrel. Sarah watched in silence, her hands clasped tightly. "I thought you didn't keep guns," she said quietly. Jonas did not look up. "I do not touch them, unless I have to." She stepped closer, her voice softer. "You were a soldier?" He nodded. "A long time ago. I used this to do things I wish I could forget." He paused, then added, almost to himself, "But I kept it, in case I ever needed to protect something worth keeping." He placed the rifle gently on the bench, staring at it for a long moment. Then, with hands that trembled only slightly, he set it down. "I used to carry it to kill," he said. "Now I carry it to protect." Outside, a crow called from the edge of the woods. Inside, Sarah reached out and took his hand. She did not let go. The wind rose first, long low gusts that stirred the treetops and rattled the boards on the porch. The night sky was the color of slate, thick with clouds that had swallowed the stars. Jonas was stacking the last of the firewood when the first crack of thunder rolled across the valley. Inside, the children were already asleep, bundled together in the warmth of quilts Sarah had stitched from scraps. But she could not rest. She stood barefoot on the porch, her arms wrapped around her chest, watching the wind toss the treetops like angry waves. Her nightgown clung to her legs, her hair dancing in wild tendrils around her face. She should have gone back inside, but something in her refused to turn away from the storm. The door creaked open behind her. Jonas stepped out, a heavy coat in one hand. He said nothing, just draped it around her shoulders. The gesture was simple and strangely familiar. It asked for nothing, but lingered beside her. They stood in silence for a long time. Then, she asked, quietly, "You're leaving tomorrow, aren't you? To get the necklace back?" He nodded. Sarah looked down at the frayed cuffs of the coat. "You've done so much already." "I made a promise," he said. She turned toward him, her eyes shining from the dim light inside. Her voice shook, but not from the cold. "Why?" she asked. "Why do all of this? You don't owe me anything, not a single thing." Jonas looked past her, out into the woods that stretched far beyond the cabin. His expression was shadowed by something older than the wind. "When I was about 10, he began, his voice low and steady. "My mother got sick. We had nothing. No doctor, no money, no help. The man who owned the land we worked, He told us to leave. Said he wouldn't waste medicine on someone who couldn't work to earn it. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Jonas continued. I carried her out of the house myself. She died the next morning, in the dirt, alone. I buried her with my bare hands, beneath a willow tree. And I knelt there, in the mud, crying like a child, because that's what I was. He finally looked at Sarah. I told myself that day, if I ever saw someone like her again, someone left to die because the world didn't care, I would not walk away. The wind howled between them, but the space felt quiet. I could not save her, he said. But this time, I would not stand still. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. She stepped closer, not with urgency, but with certainty. She reached out her hand, finding his, small and trembling. She didn't speak right away. Then softly she said, You saved me. Jonas looked down at her hand wrapped around his. He gave the slightest nod. I tried, he whispered. And in that moment, beneath the storm-heavy sky, the scent of wet earth thick in the air, the silence between them was no longer distance, it was trust. It was a vow that did not need to be spoken. Jonas left while the dawn was still a sleepy haze. He saddled his horse before the children woke, packing only water, dried meat, and a tattered map. He didn't say much, just a nod to Sarah and a promise of 2, maybe 3 days, and then his figure receded down the trail. The path was long and hard, winding through the ghostlands of his past. He passed ravines he had once crawled through as a soldier, battlefields now silent, and old cabins rotting back into the earth. At dusk on the second day, he reached a rocky slope hidden behind a thicket of cottonwoods. He dismounted and climbed to a shallow cave above. The rock still bore the scars of the war, scorch marks, soot, and blood long since dried into legend. Jonas knelt by a stone slab at the back of the cave and began to dig. By nightfall, his hands were raw, but the box was free. It was cedar, bound with iron. Inside were 4 rough, dull but heavy silver bars, the last of his war pay, hidden away when he could neither spend it nor bear to lose it. He had always thought he would die before touching it. But now he would. Spend it all. When Jonas rode into San Rio's that afternoon, dust trailed behind him like smoke. The saloon was busy. Hank Berriman sat in his usual corner, whiskey in hand, his eyes narrowing the second Jonas entered. Jonas walked straight to his table, unwrapped the cloth bundle from his saddlebag, and laid the silver bars on the wooden table. The room quieted. For the necklace, Jonas said. And for the freedom you think you bought. Hank stared at the bars, then at Jonas. Silver is silver, but it's not enough. I set a price, you remember. Jonas didn't blink. You set a trap. But I do not bargain with men who take children to prove a point. Hank leaned forward, sneering. She was mine to claim. No, Jonas said. His voice was calm, but it held steel. She was a mother trying to survive, and now she is free. I came to make sure there is no question about that. Hank laughed, a dry, ugly sound. You think honor buys you the right to speak like that? No, Jonas said again, but this does. He tapped the silver. You cannot buy honor, Hank, but I just paid for my soul. The saloon was silent. No one laughed now. Hank looked at the silver again, greed flickering behind his eyes. He could press the issue, could make a scene, but something in Jonas's face, still weathered and unshaken, gave him pause. Take your necklace, Hank said finally, tossing the small bundle across the table. And get out of my town. Jonas caught it in one hand. He did not smile. He simply turned and walked out, the saloon. Doors swinging closed behind him. The ride back felt lighter. The silver was gone, but what he carried now, wrapped tight in cloth and pressed against his chest, was far more valuable. He rode hard, eager to get home before the next storm. And when the cabin came into view, lit by a small warm fire in The window, Jonas's hands trembled slightly, but his eyes were bright. That spring, the cabin, once a place of shadows and silence, had become a home. Sarah had planted flowers along the porch rail, lavender, forget-me-nots, and yellow daisies that caught the sun like coins. She often sat there, watching her children chase the old dog through the grass, their laughter wild and free. One morning, Sarah sat by the window, writing in her journal. She held the necklace Jonas had brought back, the one he had given up for her, now resting in her palm like a piece of the past made whole. She wrote slowly, carefully. He once let go of his mother's necklace to save me and my children. If one day he chooses to place it on my wrist, I will wear it until the day I die, not as a debt, but as a vow. That afternoon, Jonas walked with her into the fields behind the cabin. The earth was soft beneath their boots and yellow mustard. Flowers blanketed the hill like woven silk. He had brought no suit, no scripture, no preacher. Just himself, the quiet man she had come to love, steady, scarred, and deeply kind. They stood together under the open sky. The triplets fidgeted with wildflower crowns, giggling. Sarah wore a pale blue dress she had sewn herself. Jonas wore his old coat, patched at the elbow, but with a new leather clasp she had stitched for him. He took her hands. For a moment he said nothing. Then he slowly reached into his pocket. Out came the necklace, old and worn, but now polished and glinting in the afternoon light. But something was different. On the back of the locket, where once there was only tarnish, new letters had been engraved. Sarah, chosen by the heart. Her eyes filled instantly. Jonas cleared his throat, but his voice stayed firm. This was my mother's. I gave it up once to save you. Now I want it to be yours. Not because I owe you anything, but because I choose you. Every day, I choose you. She held out her hand, and he fastened the chain around her wrist. It fit perfectly. There was no priest, only the blue sky and the rustle of wind through the flowers. But that day, with 3 children dancing around them and a dog chasing butterflies, Sarah became his wife. Not by law, but by love. That night, in the quiet after the children had fallen asleep, Sarah lay with her head against Jonas's chest, her fingers tracing circles over the buttons of his shirt. Do you remember the first thing I called you? She whispered. He nodded, smiling faintly. Master? She smiled back, her voice soft but strong. I am no longer anyone's property. Not a man's, not a debt's. I am the woman you chose. And I choose you. Jonas closed his eyes, his arms pulling her closer. The fire crackled nearby. The world was quiet outside their walls. And as spring crept over the land, turning old wounds into wildflowers, 2 people who had been lost in grief found that they were no longer just survivors. They were home. In a world where a woman could be sold like cattle and a child's cry was silenced by debt, one man stood up, not to own, but to honor. And one woman, broken by betrayal and loss, found that love was not owed, it was chosen. This was not a tale of rescue. It was the story of redemption earned, of dignity restored, and of a family born not from blood, but from courage. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the heart still knows how to choose even after it's been bruised, then please like, share, and subscribe to Western Whispers, where every story reminds us that even in the dust and danger of the old frontier, love still had the final word.